My talk today that I'm going to go through is looking at going beyond food labelling on how we educate our consumers on maintaining food safety. So just before we get into that, I'll just give you a bit of quick background on me if you are not aware of me. You may know me from a business called Hasset Mentor. So I'm a food safety compliance specialist, and I've just racked up this year just over 25 years doing food compliance work. I actually started my life as a food inspector working for the government here in Australia, where I kind of looked after manufacturers, did food poisoning outbreaks, a lot of work on labelling, but the primary area was around food poisoning and the prevention and the campaigns that go with all of that, along with general inspection. I left the government, what do we look at, 18 years ago, and started my business, originally Salamander Food, which then I changed the name to Hasset Mentor about 10 years ago. So the whole thing around that is basically to help the food industry, and specifically for quality assurance managers and food safety managers working in manufacturing, on how to comply with the myriad of standards there are that you have to deal with, customer standards, whether they be a GFSI standard or even just regulatory requirements in your country of manufacture. I've been an auditor that whole time as well. So I was a BRC auditor and an SQF auditor. I don't tend to audit those standards anymore, just because I'm probably getting a bit old and cranky to be auditing. But my real passion is on education. And if I can do that, if I can make it easier for one QA manager somewhere in the world at any point, I can sleep easy at night. So that's kind of my bit of a quick blurb. So Simon, we'll go over to really what the purpose is of the talk that I'm doing today. Like I said before, we are looking at going beyond food labelling in educating consumers. The purpose really today is to start having and start thinking about different ways or alternate ways that we can further educate our customers or our consumers on how to make sure that the product that they're eating is actually safe. So when I talk about customers and consumers, I'm not talking about B2B customer. So I'm not talking about you selling your food to another business. I'm talking about you selling a product directly to the person who's going to end up eating that product. So I just wanted to get that clear on what that definition actually was around for this presentation. So there's a couple of reasons that kind of inspired me to start looking into this whole area a lot more in depth. And probably the first thing was the fact that a survey that came out in 2015 by the World Health Organization basically came through and said that there's almost 1 in 10 people will fall ill with food poisoning. So that's every year this happens. 1 in 10 people every year will get a foodborne disease or suffer from some type of foodborne disease. So the report basically started to go in, and they talked about foodborne diseases being caused by around about 31 different agents. So take that as a hint. If you're doing a hazard analysis in your business, it's probably a good idea to have a look at that report, see what agents they've identified, and you really should be doing your hazard analysis on those agents as well. So they're things like bacteria, viruses, parasites, toxins, there's certain chemicals. Based on those stats, they then came out with another stat that said every year foodborne diseases cause around about 420,000 deaths. 125,000 of those were children under the age of 5 years old. So we're looking at around about 30% of those deaths, or a third of those deaths, were actually for children. This is a massive thing globally. It doesn't seem to be getting any better from what we see. So we need to start taking, what we've done in the past doesn't seem to be working. Now, we don't really have too many stats on how many of those deaths or those food poisoning diseases that people contract are actually related to people preparing food in their home. So really got nothing to do with the food industry, it's actual personal practices at home. So they haven't given any data around about that. But when I was working with the health department, the majority of the food poisoning outbreaks that we did investigate were based on, or they were, the source was people and their food preparation in the home. So that kind of triggered me to start thinking about this whole thing about why isn't the message actually getting through. We can see from, again, this report by the World Health Organization, we have, just to give you a bit of an idea, the most amount of the foodborne diseases generally happen in the low to middle income countries and are generally linked to things like unsafe water, poor hygiene, inadequate conditions for food production and storage because of lower levels of literacy and education, insufficient food safety legislation or implementation of that legislation. So that tends to be quite a few of the drivers. In Europe, in the European region, they're talking about I think it was around about 23 million people fall ill every year, which is around about 5,000 deaths. If you're in the Americas region, they had the second lowest, but there was still 77 million people every year fall ill from eating contaminated food, which results in around about 9,000 deaths a year. So again, they're quite frightening figures. Probably the first thing I want to ask you now is how much responsibility do you think, you personally, in your position, think that the consumer should take for food safety after they've been sold the food? A lot of you would say 100%. So that's basically what you're basically saying is once the consumer takes control of that food, they are 100% responsible to making sure that they prepare it safely, they store it safely, they heat it, they cook it, everything else really comes back to what they're doing. But in saying that, if we're going to go with this figure of 100% that we believe the consumers should take 100% responsibility, we've also got to understand that they can only take 100% responsibility with our help. We can't actually expect them to take 100% if we don't help them with that process. I do want to have a look at the moment, the primary way that we help customers or consumers with around the food safety is we have this mechanism worldwide is to communicate the food safety risks through our labelling. Okay, so that's packaged labelling or on the package or whatever it is. That seems to be the only way that's really happening. Okay, and if you don't have that regulatory framework in place in the country where you reside now or you manufacture, it makes it very hard around, what you can and can't put on that label. That makes it hard. But at the moment, the primary mechanism for communicating the risk of food safety is through labelling. So that kind of then made me to start thinking about another question. Okay, if that's our primary source, we then need to ask ourselves this question. So do you think that your customers read your product labelling, or better still, do you think they actually understand what is written on your labelling? This was another stat that came out this year from UNESCO, which basically said 258 million people cannot read or write around the world. So that's quite frightening as well. So if we're, as a company, as a food company, we are relying on our consumer to read our product labelling, how's it going to work when we've got such high levels of people who can't read or write? It does make it very, very difficult. So that's one part of it. So you've got your people who can't read and write. Then you've got your next part where people just don't read. They don't take the time to look at a package. Quite a few people. So we need to start looking at that stuff in trying to now come up with what is going to be the solution to this. So if we have got a regulatory framework that mandates we have to label products with text or things like that, There's no thing around the size of font. We're not accounting for people who can't read, and we're not accounting for people who don't want to read. So I started to think about this a bit more, and I've come up with a few solutions which are pretty easy to implement within your food business. One of our first things which I suggest is going on this whole social media education. Now, this is going to be a big part of your whole campaign in educating your consumer. Now, the reason I start to go into this social media education is let's have a look at some stats on global digital use. I think before I jumped on the web, I had a look at the live stats of the births and deaths and what our world population is. Our current population was 7.6 billion people. Keep that in mind when we start looking at these stats around global digital use. We have internet users. Over 4 billion people use the internet. So we've got more than half of the population. We've got 3.196 billion people use social media. That's nearly half the population worldwide uses social media. And then on top of that, we have mobile phone users is over 5 billion people. So that is a lot of people who are using digital devices. I think really we need to start addressing that factor that our consumers are on social media, they're using digital devices, they're using the internet. Let's start having a look at a couple of different ways that we can actually educate through these mechanisms. Another fun fact, every day people watch over 1 billion hours of video on YouTube. Now this seems to help in our whole education factor. People aren't reading, they're watching video, and this video is just going up and up and up. Okay, have a look at your own practices, what you actually do day to day. Do you watch videos? If you're on Facebook, do you flick through and watch little videos there? They might only go for 2 minutes, but does that engage? Would you rather watch a video than actually read a whole page of text? With all this video that we're watching, we need to start thinking about, okay, so what type of things can we use video to educate our consumers with? So here are just a few suggestions. We've got how to store your product videos. Again, these only have to be, 1 minute videos, if that, 30-second videos. Think about if you see those people making recipes to food, that they can do a full recipe in like under 2 minutes. So think about doing it the same way as that. You can have your product there, and then you can talk about how, you put it in the fridge, or you store it in the oven, or you cook it in the oven. You can actually show people how to prepare your product and talk about the safety aspects when you're doing those videos. Another good way to look at is shelf life graphics. How long can you keep product for? It's amazing how many people don't actually understand the whole thing around expiry dates and shelf life. People will just, it doesn't matter that it's expired, and I'll still eat it. Infographics is another great area. We see these all over the internet. If you're on LinkedIn, you'll see lots of infographics. It's a way to communicate easy information in a graphical form. Again, all through social media. If this is where your customers are, this is where you need to be trying to educate them, is on social media. So that's like the first suggestion. So yeah, we are in a technology world, so we need to start addressing the way that, like I said, we educate our consumers through these other tools that we have out there. Videos, graphics, infographics, they're a great place to start. So our second area is to start looking at what I call simplified labeling. A few companies use simplified labeling to a degree now, if they've got space on their label to be able to do this stuff. And when we talk about simplified labeling, I'm talking about using, again, graphics. So we're not using words, we're not using great long paragraphs. It's 1 or 2 words and a picture. start thinking around what type of logos or graphics you can use on your packaging to communicate certain things. So I've got just a few examples up on the screen. If you were trying to get across what allergens were in your product, I've got a picture of fish there. There's some wheat, which would indicate there's a wheat allergy. There's fish in the product. They're pretty straightforward ones, and you may have seen allergen kind of icons before that can be used. We've got the milk icon there. When we start talking about storage, we can use pictures of fridges or freezers, and you can go and put the temperature in there, so that would indicate that arrow down or something like below 5. So try and make any type of graphic that you use very, very simple to interpret and very simple to use. We've got a microwave there. So if it's a microwavable product, you can, if it's only supposed to be 30 seconds, you can just go 30 sec. Again, we're just trying to get that message across to those people who can't read text and are more visual. Simplified labeling, that's another option you can go down. Third one that I have is consumer specifications. In the food industry, we're very used to writing finished product specifications, and these go on for pages, pages and pages. And they are really, or they have really been put together for other businesses. Your suppliers might give you their specifications, so then you can work out what you're going to put on your label, and they're normally quite long documents. Maybe start thinking about, okay, let's do consumer specifications, but not in text. So this is again where we can go and use video. If you have your specifications on your website for your company, make them into a video for a consumer. And again, these could be under 3 minutes, where you talk about this is the ingredients in it. These are the allergens that are in it. So if you've got this allergy, we don't recommend you eat it because it does have gluten in it, or it does have peanuts in it, or it does have milk powder in it, or something like that. You can talk to your consumer because that's what they're going to understand. And again, that's then stuff you can share through social media. Very, very easy things to do. Everybody, like we saw the stats there for how many people had mobile phones. It's easy enough to pick up your phone and, in your own business, record the quality manager talking this stuff, or the production manager, or showing people around your site. You can make it quite informative. It doesn't have to be dry and like you would in a text kind of scenario. So that's kind of the three solutions that I would recommend at this point, but it's a matter of, we just want people to start thinking a little bit outside the box, because we, as a community of food safety professionals, we need to start looking to bring that whole foodborne illness down worldwide. And the only way, we have to work with our consumers, but we can't expect them to keep our products safe if we don't tell them how to keep it safe. To wrap that up, that's kind of the message that I wanted to get through today, those three things, and to share a few of those stats with you. So just to recap, we've gone through and looked at the importance of actually educating your consumer. And if we're going to expect our consumer to take 100% responsibility of the safety of the product after it's left our hands, we have to educate them. Use social media. It's one of the easiest forms you'll get to your consumer. Do your simplified labeling, within the context of mandatory labeling, of course. If you can have a few key symbols that educate, that's fantastic. And also look at developing your product specs for consumers. And this is where video, again, works really, really well. If anybody wants any more information, you can go to my website at hassettmentor.com. So there's lots of tools and training there for QA managers and food industry and things like that, to help increase your knowledge and your compliance efforts.